The coffee was still sitting there when I finally looked up. Full cup, gone cold, sitting on the kitchen table exactly where I'd set it down 40 minutes earlier before I got lost in whatever I'd gotten lost in, which was nothing. That's the part that hit me. I hadn't gotten distracted by anything. I hadn't been pulled away by a call or a problem or something that needed handling. I had simply sat down at my own kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and stared at nothing for 40 minutes while my coffee went cold and nobody in the world noticed and nothing anywhere changed because of it. I'm 67 years old, retired 16 months, and that cold cup of coffee was the most honest thing in the room. I matter. That's what I told myself every morning for 38 years. Not out loud, not in any rehearsed way, just in the quiet, automatic confidence of a man who has somewhere to be and people waiting on him to show up and do it. You don't even know you're telling yourself that until one day you're not. Until one day there's nothing left to confirm it, and the silence where the confirmation used to be is so complete that you can hear the refrigerator hum from the next room and the distant sound of your neighbors backing out of their driveways on their way to lives that still need them. And you are sitting at a kitchen table in a house that is paid for, and a life that is comfortable, and a retirement that arrived exactly on schedule. And you cannot tell me with any honesty what your name means any more outside these four walls. The light was coming through the blinds in those long flat strips, moving slow across the linoleum the way it does when the morning has nowhere to be either, and I watched it for a while because I had nothing else to do with my eyes. That's a thing that happens that nobody warns you about. You start watching the light move across the floor. You start hearing the refrigerator. You start noticing the chip on your coffee mug that's probably been there for years and that you never once saw because you are always moving too fast and in too many directions to notice a chip on a mug. Retirement slows you down enough to see everything you missed. Some of what you missed is fine. Some of it is harder than fine. The freedom came. I want to be clear about that because I'm not here to tell you retirement is a mistake or that the years of work weren't worth it. The freedom arrived exactly on schedule. Every unhurried morning and open calendar and quiet afternoon that I spent 38 years promising myself was coming. It came. But somewhere in the fine print of this stage of life, in the part nobody reads aloud at the retirement party while everyone's eating sheet cake and shaking your hand and telling you how lucky you are, something else came with it. Something that moved in quietly and set itself down in the rooms of my daily life and has been sitting there ever since. The freedom came, and it brought the silence with it. And the silence, patient and unhurried and not going anywhere, looked at me across that kitchen table and asked me a question I was not prepared for. It asked me who I was now, not what I was going to do with my time, not where Carol and I were going to travel, or what projects I was going to finish, or how my handicap was going to improve. Who I was. And the cold coffee sat there between us. And I looked at it, and I looked at the light moving across the floor, and I listened to the refrigerator and the neighbors leaving, and the particular quality of a Tuesday morning that needed absolutely nothing from me. And I did not have an answer. If you want to understand what losing something cost you, you first have to understand what it was worth. And I don't mean worth in the financial sense, not the salary or the pension or the benefits package, though those things mattered too, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I mean worth in the way that a thing shapes your daily existence, the way it organizes your hours and defines your habits and quietly answers the question of who you are every single morning before you've even had your first cup of coffee. I spent 38 years in commercial insurance. Started as an underwriting assistant in a mid-sized firm in Indianapolis when I was 26 years old, fresh out of a business degree that hadn't pointed me anywhere specific, just generally in the direction of offices and spreadsheets and the kind of stable, reliable work that men of my background and generation were steered toward without much debate. I wasn't passionate about insurance the way some people are passionate about their work. I want to be straight about that. I didn't lie awake at night thinking about risk assessment and policy structures, but I was good at it. Genuinely, measurably good at it. And being good at something that other people depend on turns out to be its own kind of passion. Or at least its own kind of fuel, something that gets you up in the morning with a sense of forward motion, even when the work itself isn't glamorous. By my mid-30s, I was a senior underwriter. By 42, I had my own team. By 50, I was running a regional department with 18 people under me and a client portfolio that represented a significant piece of the firm's annual revenue. I didn't climb aggressively, didn't step on anyone to get where I got, just showed up consistently and did the work well and let the competence speak for itself over time. That's the way I was raised to operate, and it's the way I operated, and for 38 years it worked. My alarm went off at 5:40 every weekday morning. Not 5:30, not 6, 5:40, because that specific number gave me exactly enough time to get myself together without rushing, but not so much time that I'd start the day slow and sluggish. Routine mattered to me. Still does, though the routine I have now is a pale shadow of what it used to be. I'd be up and dressed and downstairs with coffee by 6:15, out the door by 6:50, on the highway by 7. The drive was 35 minutes on a normal day, longer when the weather turned or there was something on the interstate. I didn't mind the drive. I've said this before to people and they look at me like I'm slightly off, but I genuinely didn't mind it. There was something about those early morning miles. The highway still relatively clear, the radio low, the coffee in the cuff holder, the particular darkness of 6:50 in the morning in Indiana in November that felt like mine. Private time. Thinking time. The space between the man I was at home and the man I needed to be when I walked through the office door. I used those 35 minutes. I'd run through the day in my head, think through whatever was waiting on my desk, work out how I was going to handle a difficult client, or a complicated claim, or a conversation with someone on my team that needed having. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I was already in it, already operating, already the version of myself that knew what to do next. The office itself was nothing special to look at. 6th floor of a glass and steel building downtown, standard corporate layout, cubicles for the junior staff and offices along the perimeter for the managers, a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and stale coffee, no matter how many times they cleaned it. I had a corner office for the last 11 years of my career, which sounds more impressive than it was. It just meant 2 windows instead of 1, and enough room for a small, round table where I could sit with people without the desk between us. I liked that table. I liked being able to have a conversation without a piece of furniture announcing the power dynamic. The work itself was demanding in a way that's hard to describe to someone outside the industry. Insurance at the level I was operating wasn't just paperwork and premiums. It was judgment. Every significant decision involved weighing competing pieces of incomplete information and arriving at a conclusion that you were prepared to defend and that had real financial consequences for real people and real businesses. That kind of responsibility doesn't stay at the office. It travels home with you. It sits at the dinner table. It wakes you up at 3 in the morning occasionally, when something you decided is still working itself out. But it also means something. It means you are the person whose judgment matters, whose assessment of a situation carries actual weight in the world, and that feeling, the feeling of your professional judgment being the thing that other people and other organizations are relying on, is not a small thing. It became, over 38 years, the primary way I understood my own value. My assistant for the last 9 years was a methodical and quietly brilliant woman named Patricia, who kept my professional life organized with an efficiency that I never fully appreciated until it was gone. She had a system for everything. The morning briefing on my desk before I arrived, the afternoon summary in my inbox by 3, the calendar managed so precisely that I never double-booked, never missed a deadline, never walked into a meeting without knowing exactly what I was walking into. I used to joke that Patricia ran the department and I just signed the paperwork, and there was more truth in that than I ever said directly. I think about her sometimes now, about what it meant to have someone whose entire professional morning began with making sure I was prepared for my day. That level of organizational support is a kind of daily confirmation that you matter, that your time is valuable enough to be managed carefully, and you don't realize how much you've absorbed that confirmation until suddenly your mornings are managed by nobody but yourself, and the calendar is empty, and the only briefing you're getting is the weather app on your phone. Lunch was at my desk 4 days out of 5. That's not something I'm proud of exactly, but it's honest. I'd eat whatever I'd brought from home or grabbed from the deli downstairs, usually while reading through something, emails or reports, or the industry publications I try to stay current on. The 5th day I'd go out with someone, a colleague or a client. The kind of lunch that's also a meeting wearing casual clothes. Those lunches mattered professionally, and I knew it, and so I kept them in the rotation even when I would have preferred the quiet of my desk. Because that's what you do when the work is the thing. You keep the machine running. You show up for all of it, the parts you love and the parts you merely tolerate, because the whole of it together is the thing that makes you who you are. I got home most evenings between 6 and 6:30. Sometimes later, when things ran long, which was more often than Carol would have preferred, and more often than I acknowledged at the time. I'd pull into the garage and sit in the car for a few minutes, just letting the day settle off me, looking at the door into the house and thinking about the transition I was about to make from one version of myself to another. Work me to home me. Manager to husband to father. I made that transition every evening for 38 years, and I got reasonably good at it, though not as good as I should have been, and not as consistently as the people on the other side of that door deserved. But I showed up. Every evening I showed up, and every morning I left again. And the rhythm of that leaving and returning was the pulse of my adult life for nearly 4 decades, steady and reliable and so deeply habitual that I could not have told you, if you'd asked me in the middle of it, what I would even be without it. Now I know. Now I know exactly what I am without it, and that knowledge is what this story is about. I planned my retirement the way I planned most things in my professional life, methodically, thoroughly, with careful attention to the details that could be controlled, and a reasonable acceptance of the ones that couldn't. The financial side was handled. I'd worked with an advisor for the better part of a decade, making sure the numbers would be there when the time came, and they were. The pension from the firm, the retirement accounts, Carol's income from her part-time bookkeeping work that she'd maintained through most of our marriage, it all added up to something solid and dependable. We weren't going to be wealthy in retirement, but we were going to be comfortable. And comfortable after 38 years of working felt like exactly the right reward. What I did not plan, what it never occurred to me to plan, was the emotional architecture of it. The interior of the thing. I planned the finances and the healthcare coverage and the rough outline of how we'd spend our time, but I gave almost no serious thought to what it would actually feel like to be a retired man inside his own days, which in retrospect is a significant oversight for someone who prided himself on thorough preparation. The picture I had in my head was assembled from a combination of things. What I'd watched other people do with retirement, what Carol and I had talked about over the years in that vague anticipatory way you talk about something that's still far enough away to be entirely theoretical. What I'd read in the occasional magazine article or heard in conversations at the office when someone was getting close to their date. The picture that emerged from all of those inputs was a pleasant one. Peaceful mornings with no alarm. Travel. The real kind. Not the long weekend trips we'd been limited to during my working years, but actual extended travel. The national parks we'd always talked about. Maybe a trip to Italy that Carol had been mentioning for 20 years. Time with the grandkids in a way that wasn't rushed and didn't have a flight home hovering over it. I was going to get back to golf seriously. I'd played throughout my career, but always sporadically, squeezing in a round here and there when the schedule allowed, never with the consistency needed to actually improve. In retirement, I was going to practice properly, get my handicap down, play the good courses. I had a list somewhere of courses I wanted to play before I was too old to enjoy them. I was going to read. Lord, I had a backlog of books that had been accumulating on the nightstand and in a mental list in my head for 15 years, history and biography mostly. Serious books that deserved serious, uninterrupted attention that I'd never been able to give them during the working years. I was going to have time for all of it. That was the central promise of retirement as I understood it. Time, an abundance of it, stretching out generously in every direction, mine to fill however I chose. The retirement party was on a Friday in late September. The firm did it right, I'll give them that. The conference room on the 6th floor. The good catering, not the usual sad tray of grocery store sandwiches. People from across the office and a few clients who'd known me for years. My regional director flew in from Chicago and said genuinely kind things about my contributions to the firm that I received with the mixture of pride and slight embarrassment that I think most men of my generation feel when being publicly praised. There were laughs and stories and a gift that was more generous than I expected. And there was a moment, standing there with a glass of wine and the late afternoon sun coming through the 6th floor windows across a room full of people whose professional lives had intersected with mine for years and decades, where I felt something large and warm and complete, like a chapter ending properly. Like I had done what I came to do, and now I was being released into the next thing with the full blessing of everyone who'd watched me do it. I drove home that evening with the windows down, stopped at a steakhouse off the interstate, and called Carol from the parking lot and told her to put on something nice because we were celebrating. We had a long dinner, good wine, the unhurried kind of conversation that a busy marriage doesn't always make room for. We talked about everything that was coming. The travel, the golf, the grandkids, the deck project I'd been putting off for 2 summers, the slower pace, the mornings that belonged to us. I used the phrase "our time now" probably 4 or 5 times over the course of that dinner, and meant it completely every time. Carol reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said she was proud of me, and I felt like a man who had arrived somewhere good. The first weeks were exactly what I'd imagined. The sleeping in alone was worth the price of admission. 7 o'clock, 7:30, once even 8:15, just lying there in the quiet bedroom with no alarm and no urgency, feeling the morning light shift through the curtains and thinking with genuine pleasure that I had absolutely nowhere to be. I puttered around the house in a way I'd never had the time for, fixed things that had been on a mental list for years, cleaned out the garage over the course of a week, built some shelving, threw away things we'd been storing for no reason other than inertia. There was real satisfaction in it. Tangible, visible progress on things that had been waiting. I played golf 3 times in the first month, more than I'd played in the previous year combined. Carol and I took the trip to see our daughter in Phoenix, spent 10 days there, went up to Sedona for 2 of them, had dinners on the back patio in that warm, dry air, felt unhurried in a way that visits during my working years never quite managed. I came home from Phoenix feeling like retirement was delivering on its promises. But somewhere around the 10 or 11 week mark, something began to change in a way that was too subtle to name at first and too persistent to ignore for long. The days that had felt full were developing gaps. Not obvious holes, not dramatic emptiness, just a slight looseness in the texture of things, like a shirt that fit perfectly well last year and now hangs just a little differently. The projects around the house were getting done, which was satisfying, but they were finite, and the list was shrinking faster than I'd anticipated. The golf was good, but Phil, my main golf partner, was still working 3 days a week and wasn't always available. The reading was genuinely pleasurable, but I could only read for so many hours before my eyes and my attention needed something different, and the something different wasn't always easy to find. I'd finish an afternoon and stand in the middle of the kitchen and think, okay, what now? And the answer would come back smaller than I expected. Not nothing. There was always technically something, but nothing urgent, nothing consequential, nothing that would matter to anyone beyond these 4 walls if I did it or didn't do it. And that distinction between things that matter only to yourself and things that matter to the wider world turned out to be a distinction I felt more acutely than I had any idea I would. I kept waiting for the deep-settled contentment to arrive, the one I'd seen described in articles and heard about from people who seemed to have landed well in retirement. The quiet joy of a life, finally your own. I kept waiting for it to click into place like the last piece of a puzzle. It didn't click. The puzzle sat on the table looking almost complete, but with that one missing piece that changes the whole picture, and I couldn't figure out where I'd put it, or whether it had ever been in the box to begin with. It started small. That's the thing about this particular kind of emptiness. It doesn't arrive with any announcement, doesn't show up at the door with its bags packed so you can see what you're dealing with. It seeps in, through the cracks in the routine you've built, through the quiet hours you haven't figured out how to fill, through the moments that used to mean something and now just pass. The first place I noticed it was the mornings, which I know I keep returning to, but which I keep returning to because mornings were where the day declared itself, where its shape or lack of shape was most immediately felt. I'd wake up around 6:30 most days, my body still operating on something close to its old schedule, even without the alarm pulling it there. And there'd be that brief suspended moment between sleep and full wakefulness where everything felt normal, where I was just a man waking up with the day ahead of him, and then the full awareness would settle in, quiet and complete, and the day ahead would reveal itself for what it actually was. Open, unscheduled, waiting for me to decide what to do with it, which sounds like freedom and felt increasingly like something else. I'd come downstairs and make the coffee and stand at the kitchen window while it ran and look out at the backyard and think. Not about anything specific. Just think. The way the mind moves when it doesn't have a problem to solve or a decision to make or a direction to point itself in. The neighbor's yard was always neater than mine. I noticed that more now that I had time to notice things. The Pattersons across the back fence had one of those perfectly edged lawns that looks like someone measured it with a ruler. And I'd stand there with my coffee and look at it and think about whether I should do something about my own lawn, and then think about how that was exactly the kind of thought a man has when that's the most pressing thing in front of him. It wasn't a terrible thought. It just wasn't the kind of thought I was used to having at 6:45 in the morning. The phone was the most concrete sign of the shift. When I was working, my phone was a living thing, constantly active. Calls and emails and texts from Patricia and colleagues and clients, and the general ongoing digital conversation of a professional life in motion. I used to put it face down at dinner and tell Carol I just needed 1 hour where it wasn't talking to me. Now, I'd pick it up in the middle of the afternoon, and there'd be nothing. A news alert, a promotional email from a golf retailer, maybe a text from my son Kevin checking in, brief and warm and over in 3 exchanges. The silence of that phone in my hand was a specific and pointed silence, not the silence of a quiet moment, the silence of a frequency that used to carry signal and now carried nothing. I started noticing the departure patterns of the neighborhood. Most of our street was still working. People in their 40s and 50s mostly, a few younger couples who'd moved in over the past several years as the neighborhood turned over. The Millers next door left every morning by 7:15, both of them, backing out of the driveway with that efficient, purposeful energy I recognized immediately and viscerally. The young couple 3 houses down, the Ingoynes, were out even earlier sometimes before I was downstairs. I'd watch them from the kitchen window without meaning to, just noticing, just registering the rhythm of departure that I was no longer part of. There's a specific quality to a residential street at 9 in the morning on a weekday that you only experience when you're not leaving with everyone else. The quiet that settles after the last car has pulled away. The way the street goes still and the birds come back and the only sounds are the occasional delivery truck or the distant compression of traffic on the main road a half-mile over. It's a peaceful quiet by any objective measure, but when you spend 38 years being one of the people who leaves, standing in that quiet on the outside of the departure feels like something I can only describe as being gently but definitively left behind. I went to the grocery store more than I needed to. I recognized this for what it was even while I was doing it, and I did it anyway because the grocery store had people in it, and people meant noise and motion and the ambient presence of a world that was still operating, still moving, still doing the ordinary business of living. There was a woman at the bakery counter who always said good morning with the same cheerful efficiency regardless of how busy she was. There was an older man who stocked the produce section on Tuesday and Thursday mornings who I'd never exchanged more than a nod with but whose presence felt familiar and therefore stabilizing. I'd walk the aisle slower than I needed to, reading labels on things I wasn't going to buy, comparing prices on items we already had plenty of at home, just extending the time I was somewhere other than the house. I'm not embarrassed to say that now. I wasn't quite ready to say it then. Kevin called on Sundays mostly, my son, 36 years old, living in Denver with his wife and their daughter. The calls were good, warm, the kind of easy, comfortable conversation you have with an adult child who turned out well and who you genuinely like as a person. But they were Sunday calls, scheduled in the loose way that adult family life schedules things, reliable but bounded, warm but brief. He had a life with its own full weight of obligations and demands. A career he was building, a young child, a marriage, the whole dense structure of a life in forward motion. His Sunday calls were a generous portion of his available attention, and I knew that and appreciated it. But I'd grown up professionally in a world where my phone rang with things that needed me on a Wednesday afternoon, a Thursday morning, a random Tuesday, and the adjustment from that to Sunday calls only was larger than it sounds. My daughter Lisa lived 40 minutes away, which was both a blessing and its own particular complexity. We saw each other reasonably often, Sunday dinners every few weeks, the occasional weekday visit when her schedule allowed. But Lisa had 3 kids under 12 and a part-time job and a husband who traveled for work, and her life was running at the pace that the life of a mother of 3 young children runs at, which is to say flat out all the time, with very little margin for anything that isn't immediately necessary. I was glad to see her when I saw her. I was glad to be available to help when she needed it, watching the kids occasionally, handling a repair at her house, the things a retired father with time on his hands can offer. But I was aware in those visits of the difference between being genuinely needed and being available. Available is nice. Needed is something else. Needed has a different weight to it. Needed means the situation changes if you're not there. Available means it's convenient that you are. I was available. I used to be needed. And the distance between those two things was something I felt in my chest on the drive home from Lisa's house. A quiet, persistent ache that I didn't have a name for yet and that I was not quite ready to look at directly. So I didn't look at it directly. I kept building the routine, kept filling the days with the things I'd found to fill them with, kept telling Carol I was fine in that particular way. That means I'm not ready to talk about it yet. And kept waiting for the feeling to pass the way you wait for weather to change, hoping if you just give it enough time it'll move on by itself. It didn't move on. It just got more comfortable in the space it was occupying, more settled, more at home, the way something does when it's decided it's staying for a while. There was a specific moment when everything I'd been carefully not looking at forced itself into full view, and like most moments that matter, it arrived inside something completely ordinary. It was a Wednesday afternoon in December, gray and cold the way Indiana gets in December, that flat leaden sky that sits low over everything and makes the whole world feel like it's operating under a dimmer switch. I was sitting in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading, the words moving under my eyes without leaving much impression, and the television was on low in the background the way I'd started keeping it. Not because I was watching it, but because the sound of human voices in the room had become something I needed, without quite admitting I needed it. Carol was out. Her Thursday volunteer shift had been moved to Wednesday that week, and the house had the particular quality of silence that an empty house has in the middle of a winter afternoon. A silence that has texture and weight to it, that presses gently but persistently against you from every direction. My phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. A text from my former colleague and longtime work friend, a man named Gerald who had been in commercial insurance almost as long as I had and who was still working, planned to work another 2 or 3 years at least. The text said they'd restructured the regional department, moved some accounts around, promoted a young woman named Andrea to a position that Gerald thought I'd find interesting given my history with that particular client portfolio. He wasn't saying it to be unkind. Gerald is not an unkind man. He was sharing news the way old colleagues share news, keeping me in the loop out of genuine affection and habit. But I sat there with that text on my screen and felt something move through me that was cold and clarifying in equal measure. They had restructured. They had moved the accounts. They had promoted someone. And none of it, not a single decision in that chain, had required my input or my awareness or my presence in any form. The department I had built over 11 years, the client relationships I had cultivated and protected and grown, the operational structure I had designed and refined through countless adjustments over more than a decade, all of it was continuing without me the way a river continues after you've stepped out of it. The water closes. The current moves on. The river doesn't pause to mark the absence of the stone. I set the phone down on the cushion and looked at the gray light coming through the front window and sat with that for a while. Really sat with it. Didn't pick the book back up, didn't reach for the phone again, didn't turn the television up. Just sat there in that gray Wednesday silence and let what I was feeling be what it was, without trying to manage it or reframe it or tell myself a more comfortable version of it. And what it was, stripped of all the more acceptable framings I'd been putting around it for months, was grief. Plain and specific grief for something I had lost that I hadn't given myself permission to grieve because it didn't seem like the kind of loss you were allowed to mourn. You don't grieve a retirement. You celebrate it. You earned it. You're supposed to be grateful. And I was grateful. Genuinely, the financial security and the freedom from the daily grind were real gifts that I didn't take lightly. But gratitude and grief are not mutually exclusive, and I had been treating them as though they were, had been using the gratitude to cover the grief the way you put a rug over a damaged floor, and sitting there on that gray Wednesday afternoon, the rug finally slipped and I saw what was underneath. What was underneath was this. For 38 years, my value as a person had been confirmed daily by the simple fact of being necessary. Someone needed my judgment. Someone was waiting on my decision. Someone's problem was going to get solved, because I was going to solve it. That daily confirmation was so consistent and so woven into the fabric of my existence that I had mistaken it for something internal, had believed it was something I carried in myself, when in reality it was something the job was providing for me from the outside. And when the job ended, the confirmation ended with it, and I was left with a self that had been so thoroughly defined by its function that without the function it didn't quite know what it was. I thought about my identity then, really thought about it in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before, and what I found when I looked honestly was that almost everything I would have used to describe myself was job adjacent. I was a manager. I was a problem solver. I was reliable, competent, the person you called when something needed to get done right. I was a provider, a title that drew its meaning directly from the professional role that funded it. I was respected, but respected in the context of a professional world that no longer had a place for me at the table. Strip those things away, and what remained felt thin. Not nothing, not worthless, but thin, like a photograph of a person rather than the person themselves. I called Gerald back instead of texting. He answered on the second ring, surprised and pleased, and we talked for almost an hour, which was longer than we talked in months. He told me about the restructuring in more detail, about the new accounts, about the politics of the office that I had once navigated daily and that now felt like news from a country I used to live in. He asked how retirement was treating me, and I said it was good. Different, but good. Which was the answer I always gave and which satisfied people because it was close enough to plausible that nobody needed to look further. But after I hung up, I sat there in the kitchen. The gray light outside had gone darker by then. Late afternoon, moving toward evening, and I felt the full dimensions of what I was dealing with for the first time without any softening around the edges. I was 67 years old, and I had spent so long being the person other people needed that I had never developed a clear sense of who I was when nobody needed me. I had confused my function with my identity so completely and for so long that their separation felt like an amputation. The work hadn't just been what I did. It had been the answer to the question of what I was worth. And now that answer was gone, and I was sitting in a kitchen in Indiana in December with no replacement answer anywhere in sight, and the gray outside pressing against the windows, and the house very quiet, and the television off now, finally off because the background noise of other people's voices had stopped being comfort and started being a reminder of a world that was operating just fine without me in it. I didn't tell Carol that evening. I made dinner, we ate, we watched something, we went to bed. But something had shifted in me that day that I couldn't unshift. The comfortable numbness I'd been maintaining for months, the managed version of retirement where I kept busy enough not to feel the full weight of what I'd lost, had cracked open on that gray Wednesday afternoon, and through the crack came something cold and true and entirely unavoidable. I was going to have to figure out who I was without the thing that had told me who I was for 38 years, and I had absolutely no idea where to begin. The days after that Wednesday had a different quality to them. Not dramatically different, not in any way that would have been visible to someone watching from the outside, but different in the way that a room feels different after you've moved a piece of furniture. The same room, the same light, the same walls, but the space arranged differently. And your body aware of the change even when your eyes aren't quite tracking it. I had stopped pretending to myself that everything was fine, which sounds like progress and in some ways was progress, but what it meant practically was that I was now moving through my days with the full unmediated weight of what I was feeling rather than the managed version of it, and the full unmediated weight was considerably heavier than I'd been acknowledging. Mornings remained the proving ground. I'd come downstairs in the gray early light, my knee announcing itself on the stairs the way it had started doing about 2 years before retirement and had been doing with increasing commentary ever since, and I'd stand in the kitchen and make the coffee, and the simple act of making the coffee would feel like the most purposeful thing I was going to do for the next several hours. That's not an exaggeration. That's just what it was. The coffee had steps, had a sequence, had a small knowable outcome at the end of it, and in the absence of anything larger to organize myself around, I found a disproportionate amount of comfort in those 2 or 3 minutes of grinding and measuring and waiting. I'd take the mug to the kitchen table and sit down, and the day would open up in front of me like a field with no path through it. I want to try to describe what those mornings actually felt like from inside, because I think it's important to be precise about this. To not let it collapse into vague melancholy because it wasn't vague, it was specific. It was the feeling of being a man who has spent his entire adult life being oriented toward something and who now has nothing to orient toward. It was the feeling of forward momentum that has nowhere to go. Like a car engine running in a parked car, All that machinery turning, all that engineered purposefulness, going nowhere. I'd sit at that table and drink my coffee and read the news on my tablet, and there would be a point, usually around the second cup, where I'd set everything down and just sit there, not thinking about anything in particular, not resting in any meaningful sense, just existing in the morning in a way that felt less like peace and more like suspension, like waiting for something that wasn't coming. The afternoons were long in a way that I don't think I can fully communicate to someone who hasn't experienced it. When you're working, the afternoon is the productive heart of the day, the hours when decisions get made and work gets finished, and the momentum of the morning carries through to something completed and closed. In retirement, the afternoon is just more time, more open, unstructured, undemanding time that asks nothing of you and offers nothing back except its own empty passage. I tried to fill it consistently, and I largely failed to fill it in any way that felt like it actually mattered. I do things. I was always doing things. A home project, a walk, some reading, a trip to the hardware store, an errand that could have waited but that gave me somewhere to point myself for an hour. I was busy enough on the surface. But there is a difference, and I felt it every single afternoon, between being busy and being engaged. Being busy means your hands are occupied. Being engaged means something in you is actually present and invested and connected to what you're doing in a way that makes time move differently. I was busy. I was almost never engaged. The television became something I'm not entirely proud of. I'd never watched much television during my working years. Never had the time or the patience for it in the evenings after a full day, but in retirement it became a kind of default, a way of filling the room with movement and sound and the semblance of company. I'd turn it on after lunch, telling myself I'd just watch the news for 30 minutes, and look up 2 hours later having absorbed almost nothing but having successfully avoided sitting alone with my thoughts for 120 minutes. I recognized this for the avoidance strategy it was. I recognized it and did it anyway, because the alternative, sitting alone with my thoughts in that quiet house in the middle of a weekday afternoon, was something I didn't yet have the tools to do comfortably. My body was participating in the struggle in its own unhelpful way. When you're working, the minor physical complaints of an aging body stay largely in the background, drowned out by the noise and demand of a full professional life. In retirement, they came forward. The knee that complained on the stairs had opinions about the morning walk too, and about getting up from a low chair, and about the cold mornings specifically when everything seemed to move slower and stiffer than it should. My lower back, which had been making reasonable if intermittent complaints for years, became more consistent in retirement, as though it too had been waiting for a quieter moment to make its case. I'd take an inventory of myself in the mornings and evenings, the way you check a vehicle you're not entirely sure about, running through the systems, noting what was stiff and what hurt and what seemed different from last week. The doctor had told me to keep moving, and I was keeping moving, but the moving came with a running commentary from a body that was reminding me, politely but persistently, that 67 years is a long time to run any piece of machinery and that certain adjustments to expectation were now appropriate. What I hadn't anticipated was how much the physical awareness would feed the emotional one. Every morning protest from the knee was also a small data point in a larger story about time and its passage and the direction things were moving. Every afternoon when I sat down in the armchair and felt the relief of being off my feet, I was aware that this was what older men did, that I was now an older man doing the things older men do, and that the distance between me and the man who drove the highway at 6:50 every morning with a thermos of coffee and a day full of consequence was growing in one direction only. The invisibility was the hardest thing. I keep coming back to that word because it kept coming back to me. When you hold a position of professional responsibility for a long time, you exist in the world in a particular way. You are seen, not famous, not important in any grand sense, but visible within your sphere. People know your name. Your presence in a room changes the room in small but real ways. Your opinion is solicited. Your experience is referenced. You are part of the active conversation of your industry, your organization, your professional community. In retirement, that visibility simply ends. You step out of the room, and the conversation continues without you, and very quickly, more quickly than you expected, people stop thinking to include you in it. Not out of malice, just because the room has its own momentum and you're no longer part of it. I'd run into former colleagues occasionally, at the grocery store, at a restaurant, once at a home improvement store on a Saturday morning. The conversations were always warm and brief. "How are you? How's retirement? Is it great? We miss you around the office. Great catching up. Take care." And then they'd be gone. Back to whatever they were doing, back to the active world. And I'd stand there for a moment in the aisle or the parking lot feeling the particular quality of having been seen and then immediately unseen again. Like a wave that comes in and pulls back. Like warmth that arrives and departs so quickly, you're left wondering if you imagined it. I didn't talk about any of this adequately. Not to Carol, not to my son or daughter, not to Phil, not to anyone. Men of my generation have a specific and deeply ingrained relationship with emotional disclosure, which is to say we largely don't do it, at least not directly, at least not in the plain language of feelings and needs and fears that would have actually communicated what was happening. I give Carol the condensed, acceptable version, the fine but different version, and she'd accept it with the particular patience of a woman who has been married to the same man for a very long time and knows the difference between what he's saying and what he means, but also knows that pushing too hard too soon doesn't help. So I carried it. I carried it through the long mornings and the empty afternoons and the nights that had gotten harder. The 2 and 3 in the morning wakefulness that left me lying in the dark beside Carol's quiet breathing with my thoughts running free and nowhere to send them. Those dark morning hours were the most honest hours of my day. No television, no errands, no projects, no performance of being fine. Just me in the dark and the refrigerator humming downstairs and the occasional car moving past on the street outside and the full, unvarnished truth of where I was and what I was feeling and how far the distance was between the retirement I had pictured and the one I was actually living. There is a kind of thinking that only becomes possible when you finally stop moving fast enough to outrun it. I had been moving fast for 38 years, not recklessly, not without intention, but consistently forward. Always oriented toward the next thing, the next quarter, the next problem, the next milestone. And that forward orientation is excellent for building a career and providing for a family and achieving the measurable goals that a working life sets in front of you. What it is less excellent for is honest reflection. Because honest reflection requires you to stop and turn around and look at what's behind you, and when you're moving forward at the pace a demanding career requires, turning around is a luxury you rarely allow yourself. Retirement took away the forward motion and left me with all the turning around I hadn't done. And I want to tell you what I found when I finally looked. The first thing I found, the one that sits heaviest on me still, is the years with my boys. I have 2 sons, Kevin and Daniel. Kevin is 36, lives in Denver, works in tech, doing well by every measure. Daniel is 33, lives here in Indianapolis actually, 20 minutes from the house, works in healthcare administration, married with 2 kids of his own now. Both of them turned out well. Both of them are men I'm proud of in the complete and uncomplicated way that a father is proud when his children become genuinely good people. But turning out well doesn't mean the years of their growing up were what they should have been. And sitting in the long, quiet afternoons of retirement with nothing to do but be honest, I have to acknowledge that I was not as present for those years as I should have been or as I told myself I was at the time. Kevin was 10 when I made senior underwriter. Daniel was 7. Those promotions and the ones that followed happened during the years that matter most in a child's life. The years that lay down the foundation of how a boy understands his father, and by extension understands what it means to be a man. And during those years I was building something at the office that consumed the best and most energetic hours of my days, that followed me home in my head every evening, that pulled my attention toward itself even when I was physically present at the dinner table or the Little League game or the school play. I was there for the events. I want to be clear about that because it matters, and because I think some men of my generation use absence as shorthand for failure in a way that flattens a more complicated reality. I was at the games. I was at the graduations. I was at the dinners most nights, not every night, but most. What I was less reliably present for was the ordinary unmarked time between the events. The Tuesday evening when a boy just wants to talk to his father about nothing in particular. The Saturday morning with no agenda. The slow, unscheduled hours when real closeness gets built, not through significant moments but through the simple accumulated weight of being together without purpose. I was not good at purposeless time when my boys were growing up. I didn't have patience for it. I was a man who organized himself around tasks and outcomes and the satisfying forward motion of things getting done. And a 10-year-old who just wants to sit with you and watch television or throw a ball in the driveway with no particular goal isn't oriented toward tasks or outcomes. He's oriented toward you. And I missed that orientation too many times because I was oriented somewhere else. I remember a specific Saturday when Kevin was maybe 12 or 13. He'd asked me earlier that week if we could go to the driving range that weekend, just the two of us, which was something we'd done a handful of times before, and which I'd always enjoyed more than I expected to. I said sure, Saturday sounds good. And then something came up at the office Friday afternoon. Some coverage issue with a major client that needed resolution, and I spent most of Saturday on the phone and at the kitchen table with my laptop dealing with it. I told Kevin we'd go next weekend. Next weekend something else came up. I don't remember if we ever did go that particular time. I don't remember, and he's never mentioned it, and that not remembering and that not mentioning together form a kind of quiet verdict that I've been sitting with more and more in these retirement hours. There were a lot of next weekends. With Daniel, too, who was quieter than Kevin, and therefore easier to overlook in the specific way that quiet children get overlooked. Not out of any intention, but simply because they don't demand your attention the way louder children do. Daniel would have been fine, that's what I told myself. Daniel is easygoing. Daniel doesn't need as much. Daniel's okay. And maybe that was true. But I've watched Daniel with his own kids now. Watched the way he gets down on the floor with them. The way he puts his phone in the other room when they're talking to him. The way he is physically and completely present with them in a way that costs him something, but that he gives without resentment. And I've understood watching him that he learned something I never taught him. He learned it despite me, or around me, or from Carol, or from some other source I don't know about, but not from me, and that sits on me. Carol is the other major chapter in the honest accounting. We have been married for 41 years, and Carol is the best decision I ever made, a fact that I understood in some general appreciative way throughout our marriage, but that I understand with much greater specificity now that I have the time and the stillness to look at it clearly. She held everything together. That is not an exaggeration or a sentiment. It is a precise description of what she did for 4 decades. She managed the household and the children and the social obligations and the relationship with both sets of parents as they aged and needed more, and she did all of it while working part-time for most of those years and being the emotional center of a family whose other central figure was frequently somewhere else in his head, even when he was physically present. I thanked her. I want to be honest about that too. I wasn't entirely blind to what she was doing. I expressed appreciation. I acknowledged her contributions. I told her and the kids and anyone who asked that Carol was the one who really kept the family running. But there's a difference between acknowledging something and actually sharing the weight of it, and I acknowledged far more than I shared. The mental load, which is a phrase I only learned after retirement from an article Carol left on the kitchen table that I suspect was not left there accidentally. The mental load of a family is not just the physical tasks, but the constant background processing, the remembering and anticipating and planning and managing that never stops, that runs underneath everything else like a program that's always open. Carol ran that program for 41 years, while I ran my professional program and assumed the two were equivalent contributions. They were not equivalent. Mine had a salary attached, and an office and a title and colleagues who respected me for it. Hers had none of those external validations, and I did not provide enough internal validation to compensate for their absence. I see that now with a clarity I didn't have when I was inside it, and the seeing is uncomfortable in the specific way that honest self-assessment is uncomfortable, not devastating, not paralyzing, but genuinely uncomfortable in a way that deserves to be sat with rather than explained away. I am not making a case against myself here. Not trying to render a verdict on 41 years of marriage and fatherhood from the unfair vantage point of retirement hindsight. Most days I was doing the best I knew how with the understanding I had at the time and the demands that were genuinely on me. But the best I knew how left gaps, and the gaps left marks, and sitting in the long, honest hours of retirement, I can see the marks in a way the forward motion of a working life never allowed me to see them. And seeing them, really seeing them without looking away, turns out to be the only honest way through. Somewhere around the 10-month mark of retirement, I made a decision that wasn't dramatic and wasn't announced to anyone, but that represented a real internal shift from one mode to another. The shift was this. I stopped waiting for retirement to feel the way I thought it was going to feel, and started trying to make it feel like something real through actual effort and actual honesty about what I needed, rather than what I thought I was supposed to need. That sounds simple stated plainly like that, and it was not simple at all. It required admitting things to myself that I had been resistant to admitting, primarily that the life I'd built for the first 10 months of retirement, the filling of days with tasks and errands and home projects and golf when Phil was available, was a functional life, but not a meaningful one, and that the difference between functional and meaningful was exactly the distance I needed to close. Carol had said something to me one evening that I'd been turning over ever since. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, one of those early spring evenings that arrives like a promise after an Indiana winter, and she said without preamble or particular urgency that she thought I was spending a lot of energy trying to look like I was okay rather than actually trying to get there. She said it quietly and without accusation, the way she says the things that matter. And I started to object and then stopped, because the objection died on its way out when I recognized it for what it was, which was exactly the kind of defensive posturing she was describing. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and then I started trying. The first thing I did was call my doctor and be honest with him about what I'd been experiencing, the sleeplessness, the low-grade persistent flatness, the loss of motivation, the way the days felt like they were passing over me rather than through me. I'd been giving my doctor the same fine but different version I gave everyone else, and he'd been accepting it because I presented it convincingly and because I'm a man of a generation that doesn't volunteer emotional difficulty to medical professionals any more than we volunteer it anywhere else. When I was honest, he listened carefully, and we talked for longer than a routine appointment usually runs, and he said some things that were useful and some things that were clinical, and one thing that has stayed with me, which was that what I was describing sounded less like depression in the clinical sense and more like a profound identity transition that I hadn't been given any tools to navigate, and that the absence of those tools was the problem rather than any deficiency in me as a person. I don't know why that distinction mattered as much as it did, but it did. It shifted something. It moved the problem from the category of personal failure to the category of navigational challenge, and navigational challenges were something I had spent 38 years solving. I started volunteering at a food pantry that operated out of a church 3 miles from the house, 2 mornings a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. A neighbor named Frank had been doing it for years and had mentioned it to me casually several times, and I'd filed it away as something I might do eventually, and eventually had finally arrived. The work was physical and simple, sorting donations in stocking shelves and helping with the distribution line on Thursday mornings when people came in. It was not intellectually demanding. It did not require any of the professional skills I'd spent 38 years developing. But it was real. That was the word that kept coming to me in those Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Real. The food was real. The need was real. The people who came through the distribution line were real people with real circumstances, and my presence there made a small but concrete and unmistakable difference in a way that I could see and measure. A family left with groceries they didn't have before I showed up that morning. That's not nothing. After months of doing things that felt like filling time, doing something that felt like filling a need, even a modest and local need, landed differently. I kept going. I'm still going. It didn't transform my retirement or resolve the larger questions I was sitting with, but it gave 2 mornings a week a reason that existed outside of myself, and that outward-facing reason turned out to be something I needed more than I had understood. I signed up for a woodworking class at the community center, partly because I'd always thought I might have some aptitude for it, and partly because it was something structured and skill-based that would happen on a regular schedule and require my actual presence and attention. The class was on Monday evenings, taught by a retired contractor named Howard, who was somewhere in his mid-70s and who brought to his teaching the same patient thoroughness that I recognized from the best managers I'd known in my own career. There were 7 of us in the class, all men, ages ranging from late 50s to Howard himself, and we were working on building a small cabinet over the course of 10 weeks. I discovered in that first session that woodworking demands a quality of attention that I hadn't given to anything in months. A focused, present-tense engagement with the material in front of you that doesn't leave room for the circular background thinking that had been running in me constantly. When I was at that workbench, I was just there. Just in that room, with the smell of sawdust and the sound of Howard's instructions and the specific physical problem of the piece of wood in front of me that needed to be cut or joined or sanded in a precise way, I was present in a way I hadn't been present anywhere in a long time. I finished the cabinet. It wasn't beautiful. Howard was generous in his assessment of it, and I was realistic in mine, but it was solid, and it was made by my hands, and it stood in the corner of the den, and every time I looked at it, I felt something that I eventually identified as the quiet satisfaction of having made something from nothing. I hadn't felt that in a long time. I signed up for the next session. Phil and I formalized our golf into a standing Wednesday morning arrangement that we treated with the seriousness of a professional commitment, which meant we actually kept it instead of letting it drift the way casual plans drift. 9 holes at the municipal course, coffee in the clubhouse after, conversation that ranged widely and went nowhere in particular and was exactly what I needed, 2 or 3 times more than I was getting it. Phil had navigated retirement better than I had found his footing earlier and more naturally, and without ever being instructional about it, he modeled something for me in those Wednesday mornings that was useful. He modeled the possibility of a man being genuinely at ease in his retired life, not performing ease, but actually inhabiting it. And while I wasn't there yet, I could see it from where I was, and that visibility helped. I started being more honest with Carol. That was perhaps the most important thing I did during this period of searching, though it was also the hardest and the most incremental. I started slowly and imperfectly, telling her more of the truth about what I was experiencing, not in any single dramatic conversation, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. Evenings where instead of fine but different, I said something closer to actually, "It's been a hard week, and here's why." She received those moments with the grace that 41 years of marriage had given her, without alarm, without fixing, without anything other than the steady, attentive presence of someone who had been waiting patiently for me to arrive at the conversation she'd known we needed to have. Those conversations didn't solve anything immediately, but they made me less alone inside what I was carrying, and being less alone inside it made it lighter, and lighter made it more manageable, and more manageable meant I could actually start working on it rather than just enduring it. I won't tell you that the searching resolved itself cleanly or that I found the one thing that made everything click into place, because that's not how it went. And I suspect it's not how it went, and I suspect it's not how it goes for most people who go through this. It went more like a slow accumulation of small real things, the food pantry and the woodworking and the Wednesday golf and the honest conversations, each one modest by itself but together, building something that had more substance than what I'd been living in for the first 10 months. Not a replacement for what I'd lost, something different. Something that was mine, not because a job title assigned it to me, but because I had chosen it and shown up for it and built it deliberately, out of the material of a life that still had real things left in it, even if those things were quieter and smaller and less visible to the outside world than the things I'd built before. Acceptance didn't come the way I thought it would. I think somewhere in the back of my mind I had a picture of it arriving as a kind of resolution, a morning where I woke up and the questions had settled and the restlessness had quieted, and everything felt arranged into something I could recognize as peace. That picture was wrong. What actually happened was slower and less dramatic and more honest than any single moment of resolution could have been. It happened the way a season changes, not in one day, but across many days, each one slightly different from the last, in ways too small to measure individually, but adding up over time to something unmistakably different from where you started. There was a morning in late April, about 14 months into retirement, that I keep coming back to as a kind of marker, not because anything significant happened, but because of the quality of feeling it had, which was different enough from what had come before it that I noticed it in real time rather than in retrospect. I was sitting on the back porch with my coffee, the first genuinely warm morning after a long Indiana winter. The kind of morning where the air has that particular freshness that only exists for a few weeks before summer heat settles in and changes everything. The yard was greening up. A pair of cardinals were doing whatever cardinals do in the bushes along the back fence. Carol was inside. I could hear the faint sound of her moving through her morning. The specific domestic music of a house that is lived in and cared for. And I sat there with my coffee, and I did not feel the pull. That was the thing I noticed. The restlessness that had been my constant companion for over a year, That low, persistent hum of wrongness, of being in the wrong place doing the wrong thing, of waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet, was quiet. Not gone, I don't want to overstate it, but quiet, resting. And in its place was something I had to sit with for a while before I could name it. Something that felt tentative and unfamiliar, but that I eventually recognized, carefully and without too much pressure, as something close to okay. I want to be precise about what I mean by okay, because I think the word gets used too loosely, and I don't want to suggest I'd arrived somewhere better than I had. Okay did not mean happy in any uncomplicated sense. It did not mean the grief for what I'd lost was finished, or that the questions about identity and purpose had been answered. It meant that I was sitting on my back porch on an April morning, and I was not fighting the morning. I was not enduring it or filling it or managing it or performing my way through it. I was just in it, present in it without an underlying current of resistance running beneath the surface. That was new. That was genuinely new, and I recognized it as such. The shift had happened gradually through the accumulation of things I'd been building. The food pantry had given me 2 mornings a week of genuine outward purpose, and the regularity of it had created something I hadn't expected, which was a community. Small and unpretentious, but real. A handful of people I now knew by name and history and habit who expected me on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and whose expectations, modest as they were, constituted a form of being needed that I had underestimated before I had it. Howard's woodworking class had given me a skill that was growing and a practice that demanded presence and a Monday evening I actually looked forward to. Phil's Wednesday golf had given me consistent male companionship of the uncomplicated kind that does more for a man's emotional equilibrium than most men will openly acknowledge. And Carol had given me what she had always given me, but which I was finally receiving, more fully and honestly, the daily sustaining reality of being genuinely known by another person, of having someone in the house who understood exactly who I was and chose to be there anyway. What I was learning, slowly and imperfectly, was that the identity I had lost when the job ended was real, and its loss was real, and the grief for it was legitimate. But it was not the only identity available to me. It was the one I had built most thoroughly and relied on most completely, but underneath it and alongside it, there had always been other things. A husband, a father, a neighbor, a man with particular curiosities and particular capacities and a particular way of being in the world that did not begin and end with an office on the 6th floor of a glass building in downtown Indianapolis. I had just never had to look for those other things before because the professional identity had been so total and so continuously confirmed that the others never needed to carry much weight. Now they needed to carry more, and I was learning, tentatively and with real effort, to let them. The aging body was something I was making a separate peace with, too, distinct from but connected to the larger acceptance. I had been in a low-level argument with my body for most of the first year of retirement, resenting its complaints, and its slowdowns, and its daily reminders that 67 years is not nothing, and that the machinery was running on a different schedule than it used to. I was making less of an argument now. Not surrendering, not giving up on staying active and functional. The doctor was still right about keeping moving, and I was still moving. But accepting that the morning knee and the afternoon back and the general recalibration of energy and recovery were not failures or indignities, but simply the honest reality of a body that had worked hard for a long time and deserved a different kind of consideration than I'd been giving it. That acceptance, small and physical as it was, felt connected to the larger one. It felt like part of the same practice of receiving the life I actually had, rather than arguing with it for not being the life I'd expected or the life I used to have. I still had mornings where the emptiness visited. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story of recovery from something like this can get told in a way that makes the difficult parts sound more finished than they actually are. There were still mornings where I came downstairs and felt the weight of the quiet and the absence of consequence, and the specific grief of a man who used to matter in a larger way, and now mattered in a smaller one. Those mornings were real, and they continued to be real, but they were no longer the whole story. They were part of a larger story that also contained April mornings on the back porch with good coffee and cardinals in the bushes and Carol inside, and the slow, genuine satisfaction of a life that was smaller than it used to be, but more honestly mine than it had ever quite managed to be before. I want to be careful here because I am not a man who likes to be preached at. and I have no interest in preaching at you. What I'm about to share is not advice in the instructional sense, not a list of things you should do or a program that worked for me that will definitely work for you. It's more like things I noticed. Things that turn out to be true in my particular experience that might be worth something to you if you're anywhere near where I was or heading toward it, which if you stayed with this story this long, I suspect you might be. The first thing I noticed is that nobody prepares you for the identity part, and that this is a serious gap in the way we talk about retirement in this country. We talk about it almost entirely in financial terms, in healthcare terms, in leisure terms, in the language of what you'll do and where you'll go and whether the numbers will hold up. Almost nobody talks about who you'll be. And for men and women of my generation who built their sense of self around their professional function, who answered the question of what are you with what they did for a living for 30 or 40 years, the identity question is not a small footnote to the retirement conversation. It is the conversation. If you are still working and retirement is somewhere on your horizon, I would gently suggest starting to think about that question now, while you still have the structure of work to stand in while you think about it. Not the financial planning. You likely have people helping you with that. The other planning. Who are you when you are not your job title? What do you actually care about when the job is no longer telling you what to care about? What kind of days do you want to live in? And what do you need those days to contain in order to feel like they mean something? These are not comfortable questions, and they don't have quick answers, but they are worth sitting with before you need the answers rather than after. The second thing I noticed is about time and what an abundance of it actually feels like from the inside. I thought retirement would give me time, and it did, but I was completely unprepared for the weight of unstructured time, for the way it sits on you when it has no shape and no demand and no consequence attached to it. Time without structure is not the same as freedom. Freedom requires something to be free toward, some direction or purpose or investment that gives the open time its meaning. Without that, open time is just emptiness with better lighting. What I found, slowly and through real effort, is that you have to build structure deliberately in retirement in a way you never had to, when work was building it for you automatically. And the structure you build has to contain things that connect you outward, to other people, to genuine need, to something that would notice your absence. Because the self-directed hobbies and the solo projects, as good as they are not enough on their own to replace the outward-facing purpose that work provided. The third thing is about the people, and I want to say this plainly because I think it matters more than anything else on this list. Do not isolate. I know that men of our generation were not raised to reach toward other people when we're struggling. We're not given the language or the permission or the modeling for that kind of reaching. And I know that the particular pride of a man who has spent decades being the competent one, the one who handled things, makes admitting difficulty feel like a betrayal of something important. It is not a betrayal. It is just being human. The Wednesday golf with Phil, the honest conversations with Carol that I finally started having around the 10-month mark, the Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the food pantry with Frank and the other regulars, these connections were not peripheral to my finding my footing in retirement. They were the footing. We are not built for the kind of sustained solitude that retirement can become if you let it, and reaching toward other people, even imperfectly and awkwardly and without the right words, is not weakness. It is the most practical thing you can do for yourself at this stage of life. The fourth thing I noticed is about the body, and I'll keep this one brief because I think most of us already know it and just need to hear it said plainly. Stay moving. Not because it will restore you to what you were at 50, it won't, but because the alternative is a downward spiral that moves faster than you expect and is harder to reverse than you'd like. The knee and the back and the general morning protest of an aging body are manageable if you keep moving and considerably less manageable if you stop. Beyond the physical, staying active keeps you in the world in a way that matters to the emotional side of things too. A man who walks every morning is a man who sees his neighborhood and his neighbors and the sky and the season and all the small ordinary evidence that the world is still going and he is still in it. That matters more than it sounds. And the last thing, the one I want to leave you with because it took me the longest to understand and cost me the most to learn, is this. The silence is not the enemy. I spent the better part of a year fighting it, filling it, avoiding it, resenting it. But the silence is where you finally meet yourself without the noise of a professional life covering for you, where you find out who you actually are when nobody is confirming it for you from the outside. That meeting is uncomfortable. sometimes it is genuinely painful. But it is also, if you are willing to stay in the room with it long enough, the place where something more honest and more durable than a job title starts to take shape. And that something, quiet and imperfect and still in progress as it is, turns out to be enough. I'm sitting on the back porch as I finish telling you all of this. It's early morning, the best part of the day now, and the light is coming in low and gold the way it does in late spring, when the sun hasn't climbed high enough yet to turn everything flat and bright. My coffee is hot, the yard is green. The cardinals are back in the bushes along the back fence. The same pair, I think, or maybe a new pair. I'm not enough of a birder to say for certain, but I like to think it's the same too. Carol is inside, still asleep, and the house has that particular quality of quiet that belongs to the hour before the day fully wakes up. A quiet that I have finally, after 16 months of working at it, learned to receive as a gift rather than an indictment. It took longer than I expected to get here. It was harder than I was prepared for, and it asked things of me that I hadn't anticipated when I walked out of that 6th-floor office with my cardboard box and my framed certificates and my head full of plans that turned out to be less complete than I believed. I thought I was prepared. I had the finances sorted and the loose outline of how the days would go and the reasonable expectation of a man who had worked hard and earned his rest that the rest would feel the way rest is supposed to feel. What I didn't have was any preparation for the interior of it, for the long, quiet confrontation with the self that had been defined by its function for 38 years, and that now had to find out what it was made of without the function to lean on. That confrontation was the real work of this stage of life, and nobody had told me it was coming. I want to say something about where I am now without overstating it, because I think overstating it would be dishonest, and dishonesty at this point in the story would undo something that I've been trying to build with you through all of it, which is trust. The plain trust of one person telling another person the truth about their experience without dressing it up or packaging it into something more comfortable than it actually is. So here's where I am now, stated plainly. I am okay. Not every day, not without exception, not in the uncomplicated way that word sometimes implies. There are still mornings where the emptiness visits, and I feel the specific weight of a life that used to matter in a larger way, and now matters in a smaller one. There are still nights where I lie awake and feel the distance between who I was and who I am and wonder about the years I have left and what I want to do with them. Those things are still real, and I expect they will continue to be real, because they are part of the honest texture of this stage of life, and pretending otherwise would serve no one. But they are no longer the whole of it. The whole that now includes Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the food pantry where Frank saves me the heavy lifting since my back started making stronger arguments, and where I know everyone by name, and they know me and my absence would be noticed, and that noticing matters to me more than I can easily explain. It includes Monday evenings in Howard's woodworking class, where I am currently making something that Howard optimistically calls a bookcase, and that I more accurately think of as an ambitious experiment, and where for 2 hours every week I am simply a man with a piece of wood and a problem to solve, and nothing else required of me. It includes Wednesday mornings on the golf course with Phil, where we play badly and talk easily, and the simple fact of his company across a table in the clubhouse afterward with bad coffee, and no particular agenda is one of the reliable pleasures of my week. It includes the evenings with Carol that have a depth and ease to them, now that the working years with all their pressure and forward motion didn't always allow for. Evenings where we sit on this back porch after dinner and talk about everything and nothing, and I am present for them in a way that I was not always present for the equivalent evenings of our earlier years together. I'm 67 years old. I have lived enough to understand that every stage of life asks something different from you and that the asking is not optional. Only the quality of your response to it is. This stage asked me to let go of the identity I had built over 38 years and find out who I was underneath it, and that was the hardest thing this life has asked of me. But what I found underneath, slow and quiet and still being assembled, turns out to be a man I can live with. A man who is learning, later than he should have, but genuinely how to be present in his own life without needing the life to confirm his value at every turn. That man is sitting on a back porch in Indianapolis on a spring morning with hot coffee and cardinals in the bushes and a wife he loves still asleep inside, and a day that asks nothing of him and offers everything, and he is, in the way that matters most, right where he needs to be. If you've stayed with me through all of it, Through the gray December afternoons, and the 2 in the morning wakefulness and the long empty hours of a retirement that didn't look the way I thought it would, then I think something in this story found something in you. Maybe you're sitting where I was sitting a year ago, moving through days that feel functional but not quite real, carrying something you haven't found the words for yet, and not entirely sure who you'd say it to if you did. Maybe you're still working and you felt something in these pages that made you stop and think about what's coming and whether you're ready for the parts nobody talks about at the retirement party. Or maybe you're further along than I am and you recognized yourself in the early parts of this story and you remember exactly what that gray Wednesday afternoon feeling was like because you sat inside your own version of it and found your own slow way through. Wherever you are in this, I want you to know that what you're feeling is real and it is not weakness, and you are not alone in it. That is the one thing I most want to leave you with, because it is the one thing I most needed to hear when I was in the middle of it and couldn't find anyone saying it plainly enough. You are not alone in this. There are more stories here on this channel, more honest conversations about the things that don't get talked about enough, the quiet struggles and the slow rebuildings and the ordinary, extraordinary work of figuring out who you are in the second half of a life. If this one meant something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stay for the others. And if something in this story touched something in you, leave a comment below and tell me about it. Not for any reason other than that these conversations matter and the telling of them and the hearing of them does something real for the people on both sides of it. Take care of yourself. Take it one morning at a time.